We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well done, Tom. It was a good show.
Great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold.
What if the real war isn't on Earth, but quietly orbiting above us? Satellites, lasers, secret military spacecraft. This isn't science fiction anymore. You've seen countries racing to weaponize space and billionaires planning colonies on Mars. But how did we get here? And more importantly, what does it mean for our future? Let's break down the hidden history of the space war. Chapter 1. The beginning of a race beyond Earth. It started as a quiet tension between two powerful nations, one waving the flag of democracy, the other flying the banner of communism. After the dust of World War II had settled, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's biggest superpowers. But instead of working together, they entered a long and complicated standoff known as the Cold War. The space race was a new battlefield in this Cold War. It was not fought on land, sea, or air, but in the stars. At its heart, the space race was a competition to prove which country was smarter, faster, and more advanced. These two nations became the main characters in this high-stakes story. On one side was the Soviet Union, mysterious and secretive, building rockets behind closed doors. On the other was the United States, bold and open, declaring its ambitions on television and in newspapers. Both wanted to be the first to send people into space, not just for glory, but to show the world whose system was stronger. After all, if you could send a man to space, what else could your rockets do? But there was more at stake than pride. The same rockets that could launch satellites and astronauts could also carry deadly nuclear weapons. The entire world watched closely as each side pushed the limits of science and technology. Every launch, every orbit, every step taken in space was part of something bigger. A silent war fought not with guns, but with brains and courage. So how did it begin? And who really won? Chapter 2. Space Race. The launch of the R-7 Semyorka by the Soviet Union on August 21, 1957, changed the very nature of military and scientific strategy across the globe. For the first time in human history, a missile had crossed the line of possibility, flying 6,000 kilometers and proving that an ICBM could indeed hit targets halfway across the world. But the real shock came less than 2 months later, on October 4, 1957. In an eerie silence of space, the metallic body of Sputnik 1 detached from the R-7 and began orbiting the Earth. That simple beep-beep radio signal it transmitted was deafening, not just to American ears, but to every leader who now understood that the Soviet Union had beaten the United States to space. But the Soviets were not done, not even close. Only a month later, on November 3, 1957, they launched Sputnik 2, a much heavier satellite, and with it, a passenger, Laika, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow, who would become the first living being to orbit the Earth. Laika's fate was tragic. She died hours after launch, but her mission was a proof of concept. Life could survive, however briefly, beyond Earth's atmosphere. In the United States, Sputnik ignited a crisis of confidence. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, could a nuclear warhead be next? As Soviet engineers advanced under the mysterious Sergei Korolev, the United States rushed to launch Vanguard TV-3. But on December 6, 1957, in a televised disaster, the rocket barely lifted off before exploding, deepening America's space embarrassment. The public humiliation was soul-crushing. Soviet newspapers mocked the failed launch, calling it Kaputnik, Flopnik, and even Stay Putnik. But America would not stay behind for long. Werner von Braun and his team, long relegated to military missile development, were finally given the green light. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency, working feverishly, repurposed the Jupiter C rocket into the Juno 1 launch vehicle. On January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 lifted off and successfully entered orbit. It was a triumph wrapped in tension. America was back in the game, but the psychological scars of being second still lingered. That same year, President Eisenhower established NASA, consolidating the various disjointed space research efforts into one civilian agency. But the competition was far from over. It was only escalating. The next frontier. The Moon. Chapter 3. Straight to Moon. Back in the Soviet Union, Korolev was preparing another blow. In 1959, Korolev's lunar program stunned the world. Luna 2 crashed into the Moon, the first man-made object to do so, and Luna 3 soon followed, sending back haunting images of the Moon's hidden far side. Meanwhile, American engineers, now united under NASA, were poring over every detail, determined not to be eclipsed again. The Mercury program took form. It was simple in concept, complex in execution: launch a man into space and bring him back alive. Yet while NASA tested heat shields and retro rockets, the Soviets struck first, again. On April 12, 1961, the world was stunned once more. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old Soviet pilot, became the first human in space. His Vostok capsule made a single orbit before returning him safely to Earth. The American response came swiftly. Less than a month later, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space aboard Freedom 7. Though his suborbital flight lasted just 15 minutes, it restored some measure of dignity. And then, in a historic speech on May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy raised the stakes higher than ever before. Standing before Congress, he declared that the United States would land a man on the Moon and return him safely before the decade was out. From there, progress accelerated. On February 20, 1962, John Glenn orbited Earth aboard Mercury Atlas 6, becoming the first American to complete an orbital flight. The Soviets, still leading in key milestones, sent Valentina Tereshkova into space between June 16 and 19, 1963, making her the first woman to journey beyond Earth. Just a year later, in August 1964, the Soviet Union formally greenlit two moon programs, one for a lunar flyby and another aimed at achieving a manned landing. The race intensified. On October 12, 1964, the Soviet spacecraft Voskhod 1 launched, marking the first mission to carry a multi-person crew: Vladimir Komarov, Konstantin Feoktistov, and Boris Yegorov. Soon after, on March 18, 1965, Alexei Leonov made history with the first ever spacewalk, stepping out of Voskhod 2 into the vacuum of space. America countered quickly. On March 23, 1965, the United States launched its first multi-crew mission, Gemini 3, carrying Virgil Grissom and John Young. On June 3 of that same year, Ed White conducted the first American spacewalk during the Gemini 4 mission. By the end of 1965, the United States demonstrated another technological leap when Gemini 7 and Gemini 6 achieved the first orbital rendezvous, maneuvering their spacecraft within feet of each other. Tragedy, however, was not far behind. On January 14, 1966, Sergei Korolev, the mastermind behind the Soviet space program, died unexpectedly, dealing a significant blow to the Soviet space effort. Still, exploration continued. On March 16, 1966, Gemini 8 achieved the first successful space docking when Neil Armstrong and David Scott latched onto an Agena target vehicle. Yet the momentum was shaken again on January 27, 1967, when a fire during a launch pad test killed 3 American astronauts, Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, delaying the Apollo program by over a year. Just months later, on April 23, 1967, the Soviets faced their own catastrophe when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died during re-entry aboard Soyuz 1, becoming the first fatality during an actual spaceflight. Milestones continued. In September 1968, the Soviet probe Zond 5 orbited the Moon and returned safely to Earth. the first spacecraft to do so, but the Americans pushed forward with manned missions. On October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 became the first crewed launch of the Apollo program. Then came Apollo 8, which flew around the Moon on December 24, 1968, marking humanity's first journey to lunar orbit with astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders aboard. While the Soviets suffered a devastating explosion of their N-1 moon rocket on July 3, 1969, the Americans were preparing for history. Just 17 days later, on July 20, 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the lunar surface aboard Apollo 11, while Michael Collins orbited above. But the story didn't end with a flag on the moon. Chapter 4: End of Space War. 6 years later, the tone of space exploration would shift dramatically. In July 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project launched as the first joint space mission between the United States and the Soviet Union. An American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in orbit, a handshake between astronauts in space that mirrored a thawing of Cold War tensions on Earth. This mission marked a symbolic end to the heated space race. Although many breakthroughs come today in space, this space race has always had a foundation that gave spirit for quick space development.